Hallo und herzlich willkommen zu Ihrem Podcast Interne Revision souverän, kollegial und wirksam. Mein Name ist Silvia Puhani und ich freue mich, dass Sie jetzt dabei sind. Ich habe heute einen Interviewgast. Es ist Jason Mefford aus den USA. Und das kam so, dass ich vor einigen Wochen wieder mal geschaut habe, Mensch, gibt es nicht noch einen anderen Podcast zur internen Revision? Und was habe ich gesehen? Es gibt jemanden, nämlich Jason Meffords Podcast Jamming with Jason. Und Jason habe ich dann kontaktiert und er war so freundlich und hat sich von mir interviewen lassen für diesen Podcast. Dieser Podcast ist daher auf Englisch und ich hoffe, Sie haben viel Spaß dabei. A very warm welcome to you, Jason. Please introduce yourself to our audience.
Welcome, everyone out there in podcast land. I'm Jason Mefford. A little backstory on me so that you kind of understand who I am. Did lots of different little jobs before I went back to school and actually got an accounting degree. And decided that at that point, one of our family friends was a partner at Arthur Andersen. And so decided that external audit was where I was going to go. I was going to become a partner at Arthur Andersen. And so that's the track I was on until Enron happened and Arthur Andersen went down. So I moved from Andersen to KPMG and worked there for about a year until one of my clients was looking to kind of restart their internal audit department. And they hired me as the chief audit executive to take over and build up a department for them. So I did that for a few years, got recruited away to become the chief audit executive at another company and start another internal audit department. So served as a chief audit executive twice. And now for about the last 8 years, I've been training people all over the world, been a thought leader. I have my own podcasts now as well. I'm the CEO of Sea Risk Academy, which is the largest online training company for internal auditors, and do a lot of executive coaching with chief audit executives all over the world. So kind of a different roundabout way. I remember when I first started in internal audit, none of us probably grew up and thought, I'm going to become an internal auditor when I grow up. We just all kind of end up in the profession, right?
Yeah, I didn't know what internal audit was, so.
No, I mean, I didn't really either. When I first was in college, it was, and you're in accounting, it's like, okay, are you going to do audit or are you going to do tax? And that was the decision to make. And never really thought too much about internal audit until I was in it as an external auditor, dealing with internal auditors. And then when my client, suggested or asked me to come, I thought, oh, this is kind of interesting. And I jumped in and actually really loved it because I feel like you can provide a lot more value as an internal auditor to an organization. And there's a lot of opportunities for us to really help. And so I just fell in love with the profession and have been, dealing with it in one form or another now for the last probably 25 years. Even though I kind of dipped my toe outside, I was a chief risk officer, head of ethics and compliance and information security, but have always kind of had my foot in the audit space in one way or another.
One thing I always wanted to ask somebody is, what's the difference you experience between being an external auditor and being an internal auditor?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a lot of people in internal audit come from an external audit perspective. I think that's why some of the historical internal auditing is the way it is, because it's based on the external audit model. But really, as an external auditor, your focus is mainly on the financial statements themselves and the controls and making sure that the financial statements are fairly presented and accurate in accordance with whatever accounting principles you happen to be following. Like in the U.S., it'd be generally accepted accounting principles. For most companies international, the international accounting, IASB type stuff, right? And so that's really kind of the different. External auditors are really focused just on work related to the financial statements, where an internal auditor is really working on anything within the company that helps the company achieve its objectives. And so it broadens out into a lot of other non-financial areas, which I actually find very fascinating. I've had a lot of experience in manufacturing, and I used to love just sitting and watching the machines, right? Because it's part of, internal audit is much more broad, which provides a lot more opportunity for learning, and I think also for helping create the value and provide some of the insight to help your organization get better.
Okay. I believe that as well. And I think that internal audit is very, very interesting because currently I'm auditing the results or effects on our company of the coronavirus. So what shall we do? How does the company keep running? What things do we have to think about? And I think this is very, very challenging. And there is no such thing that tells you, oh, you have to do it this way, because nobody knows. And I like that very much.
Yeah, I like it very much too, because I think it, again, to kind of contrast external and internal audit, right? The external auditors are focused on financial statement risk. Internal auditors are focused on any risk related to the organization. So like you said, in this time of coronavirus, we get to participate in things like business continuity planning, an area that an external auditor probably wouldn't get into, but it's fascinating. And a lot of our job is actually understanding and learning how the business runs and operates so that we can then determine what the risks actually are, and then how do we, in fact, help the organization mitigate those risks. And so I think and this is one of the reasons why I've been pushing risk-based internal auditing for 20 plus years, is I think a lot of people in internal audit still think they're doing risk-based internal auditing, but don't really understand risk management, and therefore are not really doing things from a risk-based standpoint. So what we're in right now is a great example, right? I'm sure at your company, like you said, you're helping out with that. Whatever audit plan you had at the beginning of the year needs to change because significant events have happened and the risks going forward for your organization now are completely different. So everybody should be revising their audit plan. But again, a lot of people that I talk to, they're like, no, we're just worrying about working remotely and still doing our same audit plan. I'm like, you guys don't understand risk-based auditing if that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, we still use the same title, but we audit something completely different.
Yeah.
So if the big title is risks of the organization, before the coronavirus, there would be something else we would audit. But now we changed that. Okay, so I want to go a step further into the difference between external and internal audit, because not just the topic you're looking at or you're auditing, but how about the communication process? How about this, well, I'm there once a year and then I'll be gone? Or this effect of working in a company where you stay there and those are your colleagues and you see them not just once a year, but for 10 years or for 5 years. So I believe there's a different kind of relationship, and this requires a different kind of communication.
It does, definitely. And I think that's a great point to bring up because, before we started recording, we talked a little bit about internal audit, in my opinion, is still really stuck in an old-fashioned audit methodology. And that has been based on the external audit methodology, where, you come in, you do a project, you do test work, you come up with conclusions, and you issue a report. Because for external auditors, the report that goes at the beginning of the financial statements is their product, right? They're doing all their work to be able to provide that report to the shareholders and the public in general. Internal auditors have taken that and they believe that their product is their report. And that is not true. The product is not the report. And in fact, I think 30 to 40% of audit time is spent on report writing, which is way too much time. Because like you said, communication is different, and you have to focus on developing relationships with people within your organization. And again, I think this is a mistake many auditors are making, is they try to say, well, I have to be independent. And so because I have to be independent and objective, then I can't have any relationships with other people. And that makes it so that you're a person that nobody likes in your organization. Okay? And when you're working with someone, like you said, for 10 years, you think you're going to be more effective if the person actually likes you or if the person hates to be around you? And so we're going to be more effective the more we can communicate, see those people in our organizations as real people, and develop those relationships. Because one of the kind of biases that internal auditors have is they have this belief that everybody in the organization is trying to cheat and break the controls and steal and commit fraud. But 95% of the people in the organization are really good people just trying to do what they can. And so if we go in with that bias that everybody's trying to commit fraud, we look like the jerk to everybody in the organization, right? And we only see the bad, and we try to call out the bad. And like you said, our communication needs to be different because we need to develop deeper relationships with people. That doesn't mean that we can't be objective in reporting what we find, but we have to have those relationships and actually understand how to communicate, how to influence, how to develop relationships. What some people are calling these soft skills that auditors are not spending enough time actually developing. They're more worried about how do I, create this spreadsheet or use some program to do data analytics instead of focusing on the relationship. And so until you develop that relationship and see people different in your organization, you're never going to be able to provide as much value as you could.
Yeah, I believe that as well. And I believe additionally that if you have this special relationship, it requires even more candor from each internal auditor to actually point the finger in the direction for, whatever improvement or if there's something not okay.
Mm-hmm.
But I believe as well that our audit report is not the end product. It's not the base of our effectivity.
Yeah.
So I believe that, and that's what I'm currently doing with this Corona audit, is that when I have a very good conversation with my auditee and we throw around some ideas, what could we do? What do we have to think about? That if there will be a change, and even if it's not my idea, if I just, enhance or elicit the idea of my auditee, something will change. And then that's my effectiveness. This is the added value. This is the insight we can provide through our questions. And I don't need findings or very long audit report pointing out all the mistakes. He didn't do that. I told you so.
Well, and so much of the time it becomes that I told you so.
Yeah.
And when you have that attitude, people don't like to work with people like that. I mean, if everybody listening, if you think about it, if somebody comes up to you and says, I told you so, nah, 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 are you going to like that person? No, right? And I think you bring up a good point. You use the word candor, and you can really only be candid with people that you have a relationship with. Right. So again, if you think about, whether it's, family or friends or others that you have a deep relationship with, when someone calls you out, when they're candid with you and they've developed that relationship, you don't burn the relationship because of that. Right. But you have to have that relationship first. And there's a concept called the emotional bank account. that if you think about relationships in this way, that there are certain things that will make deposits into that account, right? Being kind, helping, words, different things that you can do to build up the deposits in that emotional bank account with that relationship. There's certain things that we do that create withdrawals from the account. And so we need to make sure that with every relationship we have, we're making more deposits than withdrawals. Because if you overdraft that account, you burn that relationship. And so it's the same thing that's kind of ties into what we were talking about before. If you're developing relationships with other people in your organization, if you're making deposits every week, every month, then when you have to be candid with that person and say, hey, I got to call you out on this. That's not the way that it probably should be. What about doing it this way? It's not going to burn that relationship. And the problem is I've seen so many auditors that burn the relationship before it's ever been developed. You're not going to get much done if that's the case, right?
Yeah.
So that's why I talk about psychology and some of the other stuff too. And sometimes people are like, Jason, aren't you an auditor? Why have you spent 20 years studying psychology and learning how to coach people and, all of this other mindfulness and other things that goes into it? Because that's the most important part. If you don't develop that, if you don't understand how that works, you really can't be effective as an auditor.
And I believe the problem is that you can't measure this effectiveness because you can't relate it to anything else. So lots of people say, well, I don't have time for that. And no, I'm just putting out the facts and then they have to see what they do with it. But I believe the effect is so much bigger and better if you have this relationship and if you have the ability to influence your auditee.
It is. But like you said, I think a lot of auditors, because we're usually left brain analytical, we expect or we want to be able to calculate the benefit of it. And since it's a squishy number, since it's hard, since we can't say, well, if I invest 10 minutes a week into, developing my relationship, let's say with, the head of risk management, what kind of a quote unquote return is that going to give me? Well, you're not going to see it in the short term, but you're going to see it in the long term. And you start to see it by people actually respecting you, by people actually coming to you and saying, here's an example, because I really tried to do this in my career. And there was one of our factories that we hadn't been to in a while. And so when we were doing our audit planning, we realized that's probably one of the locations we would go to during the year. I wasn't very concerned because they had pretty good management. There was one manager that I was a little concerned about, but it was a well-run factory. So we had kind of put them on our audit plan, but hadn't told them that we were coming yet. And I remember the factory controller called me and he said, Jason, I know it's been 3 or 4 years since audit has been out here, and so you're probably going to see me in the next little while. I'm making some changes to my control processes, and I'd like to talk about that with you to make sure that we're designing it properly so that when I put in place, you're not going to come out and tell me I did it wrong. That's the kind of benefit you get from developing the relationships, is that person actually reaching out to me, and then proactively we can work through it. And so, yeah, surprise, when we went out to do the audit later in the year, not much for that factory. Why? Because that relationship had caused, that the benefit of it was they were doing and they'd ask for input as well before we ever even got there. So things were fixed before we ever got there, which is exactly what you want to have happen.
Yes, but the problem remains for many auditors then, oh, we don't need internal audit. What's the effect? How do you market this aspect of internal audit? Because without you, it would be worse. But with you, it's even better. But how do you do your marketing on internal audit? Yeah, to put it out in the world. So that people don't say, oh, Jason, you didn't find anything visiting that factory. Why did you even go there? Oh, we can reduce headcount.
That is one of the biggest challenges for internal audit. So let me give you a couple of rules of thumb or way to think about this. Because, in a lot of organizations, the chief audit executive has to justify themselves every single year, right? Because it's what did you do for me this year? Tell me how you're going to justify your $2 million, $5 million, $10 million budget, whatever it happens to be. What value is the organization getting from it? So there's a couple of ways that you can approach it. One is the ACFE, Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. They do, I think it's usually every 2 years, what they call the report to the nations or something like that. It's a report that talks about kind of the frauds that their members have seen. And one of the stats that's in there, and I won't get the numbers right, but you could go look it up, is organizations that do not have an internal audit department experience larger impact frauds than companies who do have internal audit. So there is some benefit, and you can go back and look at the numbers over time, that companies with internal audit experience a lower magnitude frauds when they happen than companies that don't. So that's kind of one thing that you can hang it on. Another one is, in that same report, I think they talk about their estimate is approximately 5% of top line revenue. So, think about whatever gross revenue is for your organization, but about 5% of that is the fraud that you are experiencing in your company. I shared that with one of the CFOs that I worked with, and he's very quick on numbers. And, we were about a $2 billion company, and he goes, $2 billion, 5%. That's a really big number. I said, yeah, it is a really big number, right? So if we help reduce some of that, then we more than pay for our budget, right? And so again, he didn't have any problem spending $2 or $3 million a year to potentially forego maybe $100 million worth of fraud and abuse. Okay, so he could see that. Now, he was a very analytical person, and so those are kind of some analytical ways of thinking about it. Here's the psychological way of thinking about it, is you look at what the objectives of the organization are, and particularly what the objectives are of the people who are the decision makers. So maybe take the CEO or the CFO or whoever it happens to be, and figure out what is it that they are trying to accomplish. And how can we show that what we do helps them to accomplish what they need to accomplish? So aligning what we're doing with what they want psychologically will get you more of that support. And so it could go something like this, right? Like if I'm talking to myself as two different people, okay?
Okay.
The Freudian ego states, here we go, right? So, if you go in and let's say you're talking to the CEO and there's a strategic initiative that's very important to the organization, maybe the CEO, his or her bonus is going to be based on accomplishing this objective, right? So you can start asking questions about, so how are you planning to accomplish that objective? Well, I'm taking this particular strategy, okay? And with that strategy, right, what has to go right for you to accomplish that strategy? And they can start talking about what some of those things are, right? And then you can say, how comfortable are you that those things will happen? And that might be where they kind of go, well, actually, I'm not really that confident. Or maybe they say, well, we've got these processes in place. I'm pretty sure that, that should help us get there. And then the next question would be, well, again, how confident are you that those processes are going to work or that they are working the way they're supposed to work? And usually most people will say, well, I'm not very confident. And so at that point, you can turn around and say, well, would it be helpful if we audited some of those processes to give you more assurance that your strategy is actually going to be implemented? And most people, if you kind of go through that thought process with them and talk about it with them, they're going to say, oh, yeah, I would like that, right? Then you go in, you do the work, you help provide assurance to them that they're more likely to achieve their objective. They're going to like you, and they're going to see you as adding value because you're helping them accomplish what they need to accomplish. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great.
So that's a couple of different ways that you can do it. And again, it's kind of following that, what has to go right is probably a better question than what are you afraid will go wrong, but you can kind of go both ways as well with it, right? But that kind of gives you a thought process for how you can go through that kind of a discussion. And then they understand, oh, so you're helping me make sure that the processes I've created are working the way they're supposed to. So when I get that report, I get that management dashboard, right, each month, I can trust the numbers that are on there. Yep, that's what we're helping you do. Oh, well, that would be nice, right?
So you're educating your CEO or whomever about what internal audit can do and can accomplish.
Yeah, indirectly.
Yeah.
Right. So taking that approach is educating them indirectly. Now, what most auditors do, which is wrong, is I'm the internal auditor. The Institute of Internal Auditors says that I'm an independent and objective assurance and consulting function here to help provide you value. They don't give a shit about that.
Yeah.
Right. It's like show them, educate them indirectly, because what happens is when you go in with that theoretical, most of the people push back and say, no, I don't have to do that. And then we puff ourselves up and go, but I'm the internal auditor. I'm integral to corporate governance. If you don't have me, then we're just not doing what we're supposed to do. And you see where that goes. It becomes like this pissing match back and forth. And who do you think is going to win, the CEO or the chief audit executive? Guarantee you the CEO is always going to win. So you don't even need to go down that path. Just indirectly educate them on what we're doing by helping them get what they already want. And that's really where we should be focusing our efforts anyway. Not what we think is most important based on our risk-assessed annual plan, but what is most important to the executives and the board. That's where we should be focusing more of our attention.
I like that. Oh, Jason, thank you very much.
I like it too. Hopefully everybody else does too, right?
Hopefully lots of auditors will like that as well. I'm very curious because you said, well, you studied psychology and you mentioned the emotional bank account and now this line of thought with what has to go right. Where did that come from? How did you follow down that path?
Well, I am a thought leader. My brain works a little bit differently than other people's does. So what I do is, I'm a lifelong learner. I'm always wanting to learn. But what I look at is trying to learn from different areas and aspects and apply it to what I'm doing. Because so much of the time, and you've seen this in education in general, for the last probably at least 50 years, if not 100 years. For example, if you take university education, especially in the U.S., now this may be different elsewhere, but at least in the last 50 years, university education has been more vocational in nature. So they teach you a skill for a particular job. University in the past, or if you go back to like the Greek philosophy times, it was more about theory and what, a lot of people call the liberal arts. It's about learning how to think, about understanding history, about some of these other things so that you can now see what's going on in the world around you and interpret what's really going on and have some of that wisdom come from it. Where, like I said, most of us, and especially in very analytical jobs like audit, we tend to just focus on the skills we need to do the job. And, again, so I've always kind of seen the world a little bit differently. And if I, analogize, that's why a lot of times, like on my podcast, Jamming with Jason, I'm doing like the rock on kind of sign, because I have taken that as a metaphor. I've taken rock and roll as a metaphor. And so if you think about how rock and roll developed, all of the history that went into it from music making over the years to where, post Second World War, it was a lot of easy listening, big band kind of stuff. And then all of a sudden something happened, right? Elvis Presley showed up on the Ed Sullivan Show. And all of a sudden people started getting all these different ideas about, you know what, the future doesn't have to look like the past. We can do something different. We can actually create a whole new music genre. And it just started going. And it was, the Beatles saying, you say you want a revolution? Yeah, rock and roll was a revolution. It was changing. It was getting out of the old traditional music genre and creating something new that people wanted. And I love rock and roll anyway. So I see this as a metaphor for internal audit as well, where, again, we've been very old-fashioned, very traditional in the way that we've approached stuff. And my view is there's a future rock and roll version of internal audit, if you will, that is going to be much better and provide more value, but we have to get out of it. And a lot of it's these soft skills, it's the psychology, it's the understanding the bigger picture. It's not getting so stuck down in the details that you forget where we're actually at. Because I see so many auditors stuck down in the details. And so for somebody who's standing back, and this is what happens most of the time with executives, they're standing back and looking at the bigger picture. If the auditor is down there in the details, they start to see that what the auditor is saying doesn't fit with the bigger picture. And so what does that do? It starts to undermine our authority in what it is because we're so worried about the details, the pennies. And you see things like this where, as an example, okay, we go out, we do an audit. It's a great audit. We come up with some recommendations. It saves the company $100,000. And we're really proud. We write the report. We go back to the executives and say, look, we just saved the company $100,000. And the executive goes, why don't you help me fix the $20 million problem I got? Right? It's a difference in perspective. And so, like I said, that's why I've kind of come to where I have. The irony is going back to my undergraduate university. My favorite course was psychology. So what did I do? I got an accounting major. So I continued to study psychology, and that's where, again, I've just seen the intersection here and realized that we have to do things different if we want to succeed in the future. Because the world's changing. We can choose to change with it, or we can get left behind.
Yeah, and I believe that the real impact can only happen if you step a little bit back and have the view of the big picture so that you can see all the influences, the context, and so that you kind of be aware of what's happening and how some things are done. Because I believe we have a big change right now because the working environment is changing so much. This is not the floor of Henry Ford or, Winslow Taylor. It's no longer that way. People are using Scrum, and you have to be able to audit Scrum projects or design thinking projects or be aware of what's going on in your company and all those influences. And I think we have to prepare for that because the logical A is followed by B way. This can be automated. Sooner or later, there will be robots or whatever, how they are called, or bots. And then all those, I believe even the accounting stuff will be one huge computer program. And you just input the data and out there comes the balance sheet and it will be correct unless there is some change. We don't need auditors to do that. You don't have to compare sheet A with sheet B because nobody has to do that anymore. The computers are doing that for us. But the question is then, how is the setup? And if there is a change, how do we recognize it? And there are all those other questions where you need the psychology side. There's a lot of thinking in organizational development where they're focusing on the change and how does change happen. And all those positive questions So what has to go right, and how do you ensure that it's going to be going right?
Yep.
So I think there's a lot of influence from Milton Erickson in there as well. And NLP.
You know about Milton Erickson, yeah?
Yeah, I'm a coach as well. And I studied with someone whose teacher was Milton Erickson.
Okay, yeah.
So he went to the US, studied with him, and I learned very much from him.
Yeah, and I think that's where, because like you said, the organizations are changing, the way we do business is changing, and if we're stuck in the details, like you said, the computer is going to do, compare A with B. A computer can do that. Auditors have to be able to think. And again, a lot of times we don't really think, we just get on autopilot, and we do. One of the points that you had about, we've got to stand back every so often. And it's interesting because in the learning process as well, right? So you can think about knowledge, skills, abilities, and experience. You have to go through all four of those phases to really learn something. Most auditors get focused on the knowledge and skills part. Book learning, learning how to perform a particular task. What they don't do well on is the abilities and the experience side. The abilities side is that stepping back, it's understanding the book knowledge and the skills, and it's reflecting on those and incorporating those into new ways of doing things based on those knowledge and skills. And developing, some people use the word competencies as well, but developing the competencies, that's the area where wisdom starts, right? Going from knowledge to how you actually apply it in this abilities or competence area. But then we actually have to experience it. We actually have to go through and do the things as well. And so unless we can move into that realm, and you kind of ask, well, how do you do this? How do you see it? Well, that's how I do it. It's the stepping back and looking at what I'm learning from other areas. And now how can we start to apply this to auditing as well? Because we're not immune. The world is changing. Audit will have to change or it will get left behind, just like everything else. You don't see a bunch of bookkeepers today with a little green visor like you used to see in the early 1900s because the computer took their job.
Yeah.
And it can be the same way with us. There already are bots that are doing the auditor's job.
Yes. But the real good thing is that our job is getting more and more interesting.
It is. And see, that's what I find is so exciting too, right? Is it's like, if you go from, easy listening to rock and roll is more exciting, I think, right? And so we get to also see that our profession and what we do is going to get more exciting as well. Now, with that, kind of one thing for people to think about, because again, as auditors, we tend to be very risk averse, very routine, stuck in our ways. Change is exciting, but it's also sometimes scary. But if we don't change, then we're going backwards. And so, again, that's why I try to pull some of the psychology and some of these other things, with the mindfulness and NLP, hypnotherapy, other things like that into this, because we have to change as human beings and be different in order to be different in the future. And we've got to start with that now. And if we don't get past our fear of change, then we're going to become obsolete, just like all these other jobs and functions that have become obsolete over the years.
But my question is, how could you build those competencies? If you're coming from this fact-based approach, how are you able to build those competencies and experiences in a really kind of fast way? Because the world is changing very fast right now. And I believe if you did your internal auditing 10 years now in the historic manner or historic fashion, what would you recommend to people to build up those new competencies?
Yeah, so part of it is, again, kind of depending on what it is that you're trying to work on, right? But realizing, again, Um, and we could go into this for a couple of hours, but we don't have time for that today, probably. But, part of it is trying to determine where you want to be, right? Because if you don't know where you want to go, you don't know what the gap is between where you are today and where you need to be in the future. I would say most auditors that are out there, again, we're very technical in nature, but we're not very good in some of the soft skill areas. Now, there's a lot of really good books that are out there, on things like influence and some of those kind of areas where you can start with, but again, it's thinking about that knowledge, skills, abilities, and experience. The only way for us to really learn it is to have that reflection, develop those competencies, and then actually try it out, right? So again, you could take something like, okay, let's say influence, right? Is a topic that somebody wants to work on, which is one that I think lots of people should. There's a book out there on influence that is fabulous. You could buy the book, you can read the book, but if you stop at reading the book, you don't really know and haven't learned influence. You have to look at what's in the book. You're going to find different things about skills, right? About how to influence people. But then you have to step back and say, okay, now to actually make it work, I need to think about a person that I want to help influence. And I now have to stop in that reflection period and say, I've learned something. I've got a couple of skills or techniques that I can use. How can I now apply this to a relationship that I actually have? And so if, in this instance, if this is something you're working on, I'd suggest probably a close family or friend first, right? But actually now take that knowledge and start trying to apply it. Okay, the book said to do it this way. I don't really like that word. So what if I word it this way instead? That feels more true to me. And then you try it. You have to experience it. And you're going to learn. Then you refine what you're doing. Oh, that didn't work that well. So now you're going to, again, step back and reflect, think about how you can do it different. But the only way is to just try it and do it and not overthink, which, again, is a mistake a lot of auditors make. We try to overthink, but it's the action. It's taking the action that's going to actually help you incorporate that learning.
Wow, this was some great advice. Thank you, Jason. But
you're welcome.
Yeah, but I believe trying it with family and friends is even more difficult than trying it at work, because when you're auditing, you're always communicating with other people. And I believe this is way easier than with your children or at home or your spouse.
Well, it can be. And again, so the reason for me to kind of suggest maybe a close family or friend would be it's a more safe space. So if you mess up, it's not as big a deal. But you can take another approach too, which is try it out on complete strangers, right? Because you already don't have a relationship with them. So I remember I think it's a TED Talk, a guy, he was trying to work on rejection. He was a salesperson. Well, rejection is a part of sales, but again, you need to separate the person saying no to the offer from saying no to you as a person, right? That's some of the psychology work, is being able to separate those. So what he did was he chose, or he would approach some random stranger every day. I think he did it for 100 days, something like that. And he would just ask them for something. Like you'd walk up to some stranger on the street and say, would you buy me an ice cream cone? And then maybe they're standing outside an ice cream parlor, right? And the person says, no, I'm not going to do that for you. Okay, well, now I got used to that, right? I understood and felt that. That's okay. Maybe the person says, sure, come on, let's come in. What's your name? I'm Jason. Hi, Sylvia, I'm Jason, right?
Yeah.
And you go in and you have an ice cream cone. So he chose to do it on complete strangers, but it was him experiencing or trying to get used to hearing no without it personally affecting him. Right. And so you could go either way. Some of the stuff, just try out on total strangers, somebody you see in the store or, whatever as well. But you just got to practice it.
Yeah. And another way would be to listen to your podcast, Jamming with Jason.
That's another way.
Yeah, please tell us about that.
Yeah, so it's a podcast called Jammin' with Jason. So I'm sure I'll give you the information so you can put the link in there. At least every week I come out with a new podcast. Sometimes it's more on the soft side, psychology type stuff. Sometimes it's interviews with other people. I have a segment, lessons from a chief audit executive that I like to do. So there's several episodes out there with me talking with a fellow CAE on, their pathway to become that, kind of what it takes, what the job really is like. So there's some of that, some where I talk more about some of the, technical areas, about things like risk-based internal auditing. Because again, I find that a lot of auditors think they understand risk management and they think they understand risk-based auditing until I ask them a few questions. And then they go, oh, maybe I don't understand it as well as I did. Right? So that comes out. There's a new episode, at least it drops every week on that. And we'll see. I'm thinking about maybe doing a second episode some weeks as well. So it's out there and available. And we've got people on every continent of the world actually listening to it. So
that's great. Yeah. And I'm a listener as well. And I like this lessons from the chief audit executive very much.
You like those?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I think you had Larry Harrington on here on yours before, right? Larry's one of the guys that I've worked with we served on the IA committees and stuff before and interviewed him. He's one of them that I have on there too. So
yeah, I saw that as well. Okay, so Jason, would you like to share some highlights or even lowlights from your internal audit career?
Highlights and lowlights. Oh my goodness, I didn't realize that was one of the questions you had. Which one do you want, the highlight or the lowlight?
Both, preferably.
Just a couple of quick ones, right? These are not necessarily highs or lows, but kind of maybe some experiences that I had where I learned something. So one of them that popped into my head, I was very young as a chief audit executive. I mean, I came into that role fairly young. And I remember that when I first started and when we were younger, we were kind of idealistic and we want to get stuff done. We're motivated. And I remember, I can't remember exactly what it was that I was pushing for or doing, but the controller of our organization pulled me aside and said, Jason, you're very good at getting what you want and getting things done, but you sometimes run over people on the way to get there. And so that was one of those, it kind of hit me like, well, that kind of sucks. But it was one of those opportunities for me, right, to actually learn and to realize that the end goal is not the important thing. It's how you get there as well. That's just as important, if not more important. And so, it was one of those learnings for me where, I felt humiliated. At that, no, I don't, at first I felt a little defensive, but then what did I do? We talked about knowledge, skills, abilities. I stepped back and some of the reflection and realized, you know what, she's actually right. And I need to change what I'm doing. And, again, maybe that was some of the impetus for me to pick up a lot of the psychology stuff that I had learned before and really try to dig into it more and understand that part of our business is probably more important than even the technical stuff we do. And we need to focus on that. So there was kind of a low and a lesson, right? How about a high one? That's what I was trying to think. What would be a good high one for you to share here? The highs, I've gotten awards and I've gotten all kinds of stuff like that over my career. But I think for me, the highlights are always sometimes some of these smaller experiences. So, as an example, one investigation that we did where there was some sexual harassment and other things that were going on. It wasn't a fun project, but being able to help protect and help the victim was very satisfying, very rewarding. Something like that of me actually seeing a direct impact to a fellow human being in this world is a highlight, right? Another one is, thinking about some of the different people that have worked for me over the years and helping to develop them and see kind of where they end up in their life based on the little bit of help that I was along the way is a highlight for me in my career. It's like watching somebody that I helped mentor, or, I've had several people that, 5 or 10 years ago, I trained them on certain things and provided them, some valuable skills to improve their careers. And now they're chief audit executives. 2 or 3 positions later, now, I saw them as a senior auditor. Now they're a chief audit executive of a very large organization. That's a highlight for me more. It's the impact that I can have on helping to make people's lives better is probably the bigger highlights. Like I said, it's not like a big fancy award. It's little things that happen along the way, but that I'm so grateful for. I love to learn. I love to teach people. I love to help people improve their lives and their careers. I've got lots of little highlights like that throughout my career.
Yeah, that's great. And I believe with your podcast, you continue to help other people, other auditors to improve. And I think that's very satisfying.
Yeah, well, it is. And that's why probably about 4 years ago in my career, I was on the road 30 or 40 weeks a year, going all over the world, teaching people, and realized that if I'm going to really have an impact, I need to change my platform. And so that's why I'm doing, online training. That's why I started C Risk Academy. That's why I'm doing the podcast. That's why I'm doing a lot of the things that I do, is because I want to be able to help more people and reach more people. And I know physically I can't do that. Even traveling 40 weeks a year, I could get in front of hundreds, maybe a few thousand people. But doing things remotely, I have the ability to influence a lot more people and help a lot more people. It's kind of why I'm doing it all.
And see how that worked out, because now there's the coronavirus. There won't be any traveling. There wouldn't be anything else speaking before a crowd. So that worked out pretty well.
Yeah, and not to toot my horn, but from my risk management background, I knew something like this was coming. I didn't know it was going to be called coronavirus, but some event like this that would kind of push us that way. Because it's been on the walls. Writing has been on the walls for quite a while. So that's what I'm doing out here, trying to preach and jam and rock out with all my fellow internal auditors.
So keep it up, Jason.
I will keep it up.
Okay, so I have some last questions for you. When does an internal auditor communicate effectively?
So communication is interesting, right? Because there is the sender, there's the communication medium that it goes through, and the receiver. So communication is effective in general when the message delivered by the sender is received by the receiver in the same way, right? There's a lot of things that can go on in the process that make it not effective. If you use the wrong communication medium, as an example, let's say, for example, if I want to be sarcastic and joking with you, if I do that verbally, you can understand the tone of my voice and you can understand that I'm being sarcastic. If I send the same words in a text, you would probably be offended and think I'm a jerk, right? So,
or I would need those emojis in there.
Yeah, you need the emojis. Emojis help, right? But so that would be, an example of me not communicating effectively because I was using the wrong medium. So the medium has to be right in order for us to communicate effectively. But we also have to deliver the right message. And here's what's interesting is UCLA did a study several years ago. Only 7% of communication is actually the words used. So the words themselves only represent 7% of the communication. All the rest of it comes in tone, in body language, in other things like that. So if we are going to communicate effectively and get our message across to other people, we have to be focused on all those other things. And that's why, again, it's not the report. It's not the words you put in the report that somebody reads. It's how you're actually communicating and understanding that. There's a whole art and science behind communication. And I know this is one of the areas where we struggle, especially from a report standpoint, because we don't write as good as we think we do. At least it's not entertaining for people to read, and so they don't read it. So actually, for bigger audit departments, I even suggest having somebody who's like a copywriter write your reports for you that actually knows how to tell a story. But anyway.
Yeah. And I believe additionally, we should put positive things into the audit report as well, not just the negative things.
Yeah, we need to be much more positive in our communications. And so again, think back on that emotional bank account example that we shared, right? If somebody is only hearing you say negative things, they perceive you as a negative person. And do we like to be around negative people? No, we do not, right? And so if we're only communicating negative messages, it's also not going to go in there. Here's one of those skills that people can learn, okay? And I call it reversing your butts. So at least in English, I think probably true in most languages as well, I can say things like there's a first half of the sentence, comma, but, and the end of the sentence, okay? So normally we would say things like, Jason, you did a really good job on that report, but you need to improve this, okay? So when the comma happens and the but, the person forgets what happened before the but. But is a word that negates what was said before, and we only focus on what comes after the but. So if I say that, then I would only remember I need to improve on something. If you reverse your buts, just switch the order of that sentence. Say, Jason, you really need to improve on this aspect of your report writing, but you did a great job on the audit. You're delivering exactly the same message, but by switching it around in the way that you're saying it, you communicate more effectively. The message is delivered, but they don't see it as a negative, they see it as a positive. And there's a whole other thing around rapport and keyword backtracking and other stuff like that I teach in other places. So, but there's a whole thing behind this in how to actually communicate and make the other person feel more at ease and more likely to receive the message that you're sending.
Because the usual way would be, no, cancel the but, use the and. So that you say, whatever it was, and please improve this. And that doesn't feel quite as good.
It doesn't feel quite as good. That's why I like the reverse your buts.
That's great. Okay, last question. Suppose you had one wish that would be granted, but this wish has to be for internal audit or for all internal auditors. What wish would that be?
My wish for all internal auditors.
Yes.
We are in a profession that is negative by nature. We usually deal in and see the worst side of our organizations and sometimes of people, right? We are taught very much to be risk averse and to be fearful of things because that's what we're taught in our vocation. And the problem is a lot of those skills that we learn in our vocation carry over into our personal life. And so outside of work, so many of us are fearful, are risk averse, are not willing to change or not wanting to change, are over compliant, right? And so I guess my wish is when you're stuck in a place of fear, it's a very bad emotional state. And so my wish would be that we're able to separate that from our business and personal life and actually have a full and rich life and start incorporating more of those things, like from a mindfulness perspective, into what we do at work as well. Because it's very hard to separate work from personal and to incorporate more of those things that we need as a human being into what we do at work and also what we do at home, so that we can all rise up and feel valued and feel joy and be happy and have that, in both our career as well as our personal life as well. So that's why I talk a lot about the psychology and mindset.
Yeah, what a great wish. That's really amazing, Jason. Thank you so much for joining me on the show. Thanks a lot.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome, Jason.